The end of the Civil War left hundreds of thousands dead and the South devastated. To begin the rebuilding process, Congress worked to help emancipate blacks and end the injustices of slavery by passing the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, the Civil War Amendments.
A former slave was free from the individual master, but the slave of society. He had neither money, property, nor friends. He was free from the old plantation, but he had nothing but the dusty road under his feet. Frederick Douglass.
The 13th Amendment freed all slaves, abolished slavery, and formally incorporated the Emancipation Proclamation into the Constitution. However, during Civil War Reconstruction, new Southern legislatures began passing oppressive black codes, rules that identified blacks as a separate class with fewer liberties and more restrictions than white citizens. The Civil Rights Bill of 1866, an attempt to overcome the repressive codes, granted American citizenship to blacks and denied the states the power to restrict their rights to hold property, testify in court, and make labor contracts. Congress followed up its victory by passing the 14th Amendment later that year. The Supreme Court, however, refused to incorporate the 14th Amendment into state law. Not until the 1897 case of Chicago, Burlington, and Quincy Railroad versus Chicago did the court incorporate any of the Bill of Rights into state law, ruling that the Fifth Amendment is applicable to the states through the Due Process Clause of the 14th Amendment. The boundaries of the Due Process Clause were explored 8 years later in Lochner versus New York, when the owner of a small bakery was fined $50 for violating a New York statute that prohibited bakers from working more than 60 hours a week or 10 hours a day. Lochner appealed to the Supreme Court on the grounds that this law violated his 14th Amendment rights by depriving him of property without due process of law. The court agreed, viewing the statute as a labor law and ruling that states could not restrict ordinary workers' hours. Roe v. Wade in 1973 demonstrated the court's use of due process in protecting civil liberties. In this extremely controversial case, the court allowed abortion based on the 14th Amendment's due process right to privacy clause. The Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment forbids states from discriminating against its citizens, a clause the Supreme Court ignored in the 1896 case of Plessy v. Ferguson, when Homer Plessy, only 1/8 black, purchased first-class passage on the East Louisiana Railway and refused to move from the white car to the colored car. He was arrested. After Plessy's appeal, the court upheld the use of separate railroad facilities as long as they were equal.
The object of the 14th Amendment was undoubtedly to enforce the absolute equality of the two races before the law. But in the nature of things, it could not have been intended to abolish distinctions based upon color, or to enforce social as distinguished from political equality or a commingling of the two races upon terms unsatisfactory to either. Henry Billings Brown, 1897.
Plessy v. Ferguson essentially allowed racial segregation for more than 50 years before the landmark case of Brown v. Board of Education of Topeka in 1954. The court declared that separate educational facilities were inherently unequal because the intangible inequalities of separation deprived black students of equal protection under the law. Congress wrote the 15th Amendment, banning states from preventing people to vote on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude, to empower newly freed blacks to become active in government and force change on the South. That outcome, however, was never realized. Southern whites took all possible measures to prevent blacks from voting, including poll taxes, literacy tests, grandfather clauses, and intimidation tactics. These measures effectively eliminated black votes in the South until the Voting Rights Act passed in 1965. Suppression of civil rights took another hit when the Civil Rights Act of 1875, which prohibited racial discrimination in jury selection, transportation, restaurants, and other public places, was declared unconstitutional by the Supreme Court in 1883. After that defeat, it would be nearly 90 years before another Civil Rights Act was attempted.